with the number of speakers coming from the University of Bologna, of Vicenza, actually, from even Ferrara as well, many others. In the afternoon, after we have the still guidelines that inspire a morning session. Don't be afraid to speak. Don't be afraid to write some questions or remarks or whatever. And if you don't speak, if you're afraid to speak in English, or if you are afraid of your language or accent or whatever, it's not a problem for me. And if your English is not good enough, don't be afraid. Don't be shy.
Well, Marco mentioned to me to make it short, since we have 10 speakers. So I was going to talk for about an hour, but I've been told we're limited to 30 minutes, so I'll be limited to 30 minutes. You know, I have a special love for Italy. I was here in Italy in 1966-67 in Bologna as a student at Johns Hopkins University in Bologna. Those who are in Bologna probably know where it is, Via del Moro. And after 45 years, I've come back to Bologna, to Johns Hopkins University. I'm not a professor, although everybody calls me professore, dottore, all the titles. I'm a student. I'm doing a master's degree in international relations with a Middle East bent. All of my clients over the last 35 years have been from Petroland. That's what I did for a living. I then spent actually 2 years in Vicenza, quite a few years ago, about 40 years ago, in the U.S. Army, believe it or not, protecting the Italians, you people, from the Russians. Back during the Vietnam War, I was here in Vicenza for 2 years and enjoyed it very much. I just retired from 35 years of private law practice in international tax, a big U.S. law firm, Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, based in Los Angeles. We're everywhere. And I've spent 30 years in London doing international tax. That's my background. I actually spent 4 years in government, in the Treasury Department. And Professor Cliff was just mentioning to us about the limitation of benefit article. As a young tax lawyer in the Treasury Department, I was involved in tax treaty negotiations. And in 1979, when we were negotiating with the UK, as a very young tax lawyer, I was asked to sit at the embassy there at Grosvenor Square in London to redraft the limitation of benefits article that was being developed. And believe it or not, I had a lot of trouble with it because it's very complicated, as Cliff has mentioned, it's very, very complicated. But it was a very, very interesting time for me. I think, you know, it's such a varied audience. I could go into a very technical discussion, very loose. I'm going to try to keep it very general, and if anybody wants to pipe in. I know you're all, if you're students, you're all thinking about, you know, jobs. You know, my children are thinking about jobs right now. You're probably thinking about jobs. Now, this is an international tax forum. I can only recommend, and I think Cliff would agree with me, that the international tax field is a fantastic field to be in. It's a fascinating field. It's a very challenging field because certainly from a U.S. tax lawyer standpoint, you just can't just focus on international tax. You have to know all the basics, individual taxation. You have to know corporate income tax. You have to know capital gains tax. You have to be familiar with estate tax. And then you superimpose all of that with international tax. And that's why it's so interesting and challenging. I've dealt with Petroland in the Middle East, and I've loved it. And again, I've had a private law firm experience. Now, again, London, Washington, Paris, Rome, Milan, New York City, international tax experience. In a law firm, the way it works generally is the corporate lawyers control the clients. And tax lawyers, this is a vast generalization, but there's a lot of truth to it. Many, many tax lawyers become service partners to the corporate lawyers. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But what's so interesting about international tax is that if you represent Petroland, the Middle East clients generally come to law firms through a tax law, believe it or not. And many Arab investors will see the international tax lawyer as their lawyer, and the Arab client is your client. So you end up working directly for them, and it's a whole different relationship. If you've ever worked in the Anglo-Saxon world, and the law firm in particular, it's very macho. It's hard work, lots of hours, and all that. And if you're working for a UK client or an American client, if you were to say, for example, well, I'm going to my daughter's birthday party at 3 o'clock this afternoon, the transaction can wait till 6 o'clock, they treat you as a win. You're not dedicated. But an Arab client, you tell that to an Arab client, they say to themselves, this guy has his head on his shoulders, he knows what's important, call me at 6 o'clock and the transaction is ready. So it's very interesting. If you're interested in international tax, you can. In my opinion, you have to speak English very well, because that's the language that international tax is spoken in. You have to be in a major city. Rome, Milan, New York, one of the major cities if you want to deal with international taxation. But I highly recommend it, Middle East. Now, Cliff has made it very clear that with limitation of benefits, there's a problem. When your man from Aziz from Petroland comes in and says to you he wants to invest in the United States, you start out with the basics, which Cliff has already explained. You have a 35% U.S. corporate income tax, and you have a 30% withholding tax with profits coming out. So since you get a deduction basically for your corporate income tax, we have state income tax in the U.S., the composite tax is like 56%. So how does an Arab, and when I mention Arabs because I've worked with them, and this is what this is all about, third country residents trying to use tax treaties. How does an Arab, where there's no tax treaty involved, how does he invest in the United States? Or actually, you can say the same thing for many European countries. There are many techniques that are used. And I thought I would explore that. I was going to do a lot of other things, but I could explore that. But let's just stop there, because that's what we're talking about. Client comes in, he's facing 60% tax. How can he possibly make this venture profitable? And that's your job, to make it profitable. Explain to him how he can do it. And he can't do it with a tax treaty. Cliff has made it very clear. The limitation of benefits article for most Arab clients. Most Arab clients don't have active trades or business in Ireland. That's just not the case. It just doesn't happen. They have active trades or business in Saudi Arabia. They might have one in Dubai. But most of them will come to you with no active trade or business, so they have no tax treaty that they can hook into. So what do you do to make them, and there's a tremendous investment in the United States, so obviously there's different ways. Also, the U.S. has a panoply of other rules that if you come in with a foreign company, you have a branch profits tax of 30% tax on that, plus 35% tax. So the potential tax is tremendous. The key to the taxation field is not the rate. The key is the tax base. How do you attack the tax base? How do you make 35% of a number of profits? How do you reduce that profit element when you still have profit? And very quickly, the basic, one of the key international tax principles is related party interest, where a company, a foreign company, will lend money to his U.S. company. The U.S. company has profits and pays out all those profits with tax-exempt, no 30% withholding, interest to his related company. So the profit base was 10, you reduced it to 1, so 35% of 1 is not a lot of money. The $9 of profit has been paid out through tax-exempt interest. And the problem is, how do you structure it to get the interest to come out free of tax? And we'll talk a little about that, the things that you can do. Now, I've been doing this quite a long time. In the 70s and 80s, we had all sorts of ways to minimize U.S. taxation. You could use utilities companies. Netherlands and utilities had a tax treaty with the United States, so that foreigners, a third country resident, an Arab, could use an utilities company and pay no U.S. tax. Or a Dutch company. he could use a Dutch company and invest in the United States and pay no tax. The United States decided it had to do something about that. So it started with amending tax treaties, but it started changing its internal law. We have a law on real estate called Foreign Investors Property Tax Act. It's called FIRPTA. So up to about 1981, any foreigner could buy U.S. farmland, buy a building in New York City, and pay no tax. They pay no tax on the rental income. They'll pay no tax on selling. So you see where all this is coming from, about limiting use of tax treaties and all that, because foreigners are paying no tax. As an aside, I live in the UK. The UK is a tax haven. An Arab can invest in the UK, buy Buckingham Palace and not pay any tax, the way the structure is. Now, why do you think that is? What's the different, why are these countries' policies different? Very quickly, the UK wants to encourage foreign investment and thinks that foreign investment will go someplace else. The US, for whatever its reason, I mean, it started out with foreigners buying up the Midwest farmland. So it was a political issue. That's how it all started. But the US believed and still believes that foreigners see the United States as a tax haven because of the dollar being the international monetary means, and also politically they see money going in. Now that's all changing, and it'll be interesting how the U.S. policymakers react to these policy changes, because foreign money is very, very important. And I suspect in Italy, why Italy is taking a softly approach to limitation of benefits, is because it wants to encourage foreign investment into Italy. So we've seen the Foreign Investors Property Tax Act. We saw the branch profits tax come in to tax foreigners. So there are all these provisions that are coming in to tax foreigners. Now, what I did for a living for a long time, and now it's pretty hard to do it because of what Cliff has said and what I am saying, is setting up offshore companies for third country residents. The key for these offshore companies is to provide substance for them. Cliff gave you an example, an easy example, where somebody has a factory in Ireland. Well, nobody does that. I mean, Arabs don't have factories in Ireland. It's just, you know, clients coming in don't have major active trades or business in Europe. So they come to you, and what you try to do is, with these offshore companies, is provide substance to them. And in the old days, we would hire 2 or 3 employees in Holland for the Dutch company to provide substance. We would have a bank account. We would have books and records. We would have directors' meetings there. We did all of these things for years, which actually, believe it or not, worked back in the 70s and 80s. It provided the substance for the companies to provide tax treaty relief. Now, all that has gone by the wayside because of what Cliff has explained on the limitation of that benefits articles. Using a Tilly's treaty in the past, using the Dutch treaty in the past, using the Luxembourg treaties in the past. All that's gone for Mr. Petroland, who doesn't have an active trading business. So he's going to come in with these offshore companies. Now, we've touched a little about the theories that the IRS has in looking at some of these tax haven investments. One thing that we've talked about is substance over form and sham. The best example I can give is where a client will come to you, a foreign client will say, you know, I've formed a Dutch company, I've looked into the materials, the U.S.-Dutch treaty would reduce the dividend withholding tax to 5%. He's not familiar with the limitation of benefits article, and he thinks possibly he can get a reduced withholding rate. Now, before you even get to the tax treaty issue, you have to then look at what are your facts in your situation. For example, and again, lots of foreigners, lots of Europeans don't follow this, is what's being paid actually in dividend. Is when the U.S. subsidiary makes a payment, which it denominates as a dividend to its foreign parent. Is that actually a dividend, or is it a disguised interest payment, or disguised royalty, or is it a disguised service? So you always have to look at what is the character of your income, so that when you believe that what you've set up is a structure that the tax treaty applies, you realize that what you're describing as a dividend is something very, very, very different. And then the tax treaty will not, the dividend article will not apply. We have all these theories Cliff has mentioned, and I will just mention very quickly because of the time being very limited. We have all these concepts of sham, no business purpose, step transaction. Now, they all sound about the same, but they're a little different, and court cases look at it a little differently. Beneficial ownership, we've talked about that. What is beneficial ownership? A term that's not really very, very defined. But when a company, as Saudi Arabia makes a loan to a Dutch company that makes a loan to a U.S. company on a back-to-back basis, the IRS has many, many weapons, and it's besides the limitation of benefits article, to attack that interest payment going to the Dutch company and saying that the 30% withholding tax would apply, and the treaty doesn't apply. It's changed the tax law in the early 90s for related party financing, saying that if you have a financing like that, the Dutch company intermediary will be disregarded,